the history of flight tests, it can go on and on forever and ever. You know, way back in the early AD years, some guy in Scotland kicked some people off a tower in a fight in about 556 AD, believe it or not. And then in the 11th century, some monk by the name of Albert tried to fly a glider. And another guy actually flew a glider across the Bosphorus in 1632, long before the White brothers got going. You know, flight tests can go back as far as you want to. Leonardo da Vinci, you can do all sorts of things. George Cayley is another famous name in aviation before the Wright brothers. In 1853, he started working with gliders. And some of his concepts that he developed, actually the Wright brothers used in their development of their gliders. They culminated in the first powered flight in December 7th, 1903. It wasn't very much after that, 1903, when the Wright brothers flew at about 9 miles an hour at 8 feet above the ground for 120 feet. 40 years later, the Germans in their rocket airplane, the ME-183, flew 1,000 miles an hour. So 40 years, 1,000 miles an hour. Fox Stevens, a great test pilot up at Edwards, flew the YF-12, the predecessor to the SR-71, 2,000 miles an hour. And he, let's see, I think I can't remember exact year that he did it, but it was, I think it was in about 1965. So things move fast. As I said, aviation started a long time ago. If you want to start the clock running at 1903 to where we are today, it's 120 some years. I've been around for 3/4 of that. I was born in 1937. And I did start flying, as Kevin said, I started flying in 1959 in the Air Force, so it's a long time ago. Today, April the 13th, is another historic date, if you're looking at historical dates. April the 13th is the anniversary of Apollo 13 that flew in 1970. You remember when Jim Lovell and Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes got in trouble on the way to the moon, and being innovative test pilots, they figured how to get back alive. Literally, if you remember that story, remember the movie from 1995, they literally took a square hole and attached a round tube to it, using pages off their flight manual, stuck together with duct tape to reconvert from a square to a round hole. Kind of innovative for test pilots. The test pilot's been doing that forever and ever. I'm going to talk what I call Flight Test University. Can I see, are there any other people here who have worked or flown at Edwards Air Force Base? We got one back there. Anybody else that went through the test pilot school at Edwards? The test pilot school at Edwards is just one of many. There's a lot of test pilot schools. Edwards, the one at Pax River, the Navy school. The Empire Test Pilot School actually started before the Edwards Air Force Base Test Pilot School started. It started in 1943. The French, the Indians, the Russians. There's a civilian test pilot school at Mojave. That's where, in the early days, where a Valley resident now and then, Bert Rutan, developed a lot of his airplanes, but the test pilot school still exists and is running up at Mojave. Hard to define what a test pilot is. You know, you have to do a lot of things. Like I said, test pilots using duct tape to get Apollo 13 back to Earth safely. Test pilots have to take what an engineer designed, figure out if it flies like he said it was going to. You got to understand the pressures and marketings behind it. Users are always wanting to change the requirements and make it better. They want more than what they originally asked for. You never can survive budget cuts. They go on in programs, and that's why various kind of development programs go on for a long time. As I said, the threats change, schedules are always changing, and technology is advancing at a fantastic rate. But the test pilot really does have to juggle an awful lot. You've heard of different kind of test pilots. Well, it's the mafia, if you want to call it that, experimental test pilots, are guys who consider themselves that because they went through a formal test pilot school. Contractor test pilots usually are ex-military who've gone through test pilot schools, and in the 1960s, the Air Force, at least from my experience, required contractor test pilots to have been a test pilot school graduate. A lot of them weren't in the early days. Production test pilots, those people that fly the airplanes off the production line to make sure that they check out when after they're built. Not necessarily having to be experimental test pilots, airline test pilots, a whole range of things. We have some airline check pilots that are here, but your maintenance check pilots, functional check pilots. After you do major maintenance on an airplane, they're called test pilots. So a lot of names are given to test pilots, and a lot of them are kind of squirrely too. I consider myself to be one of those guys. In the early days, testing was done near Dayton, Ohio. McCook Field was where the area where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base later became. McCook Field was near Huffman Prairie, where the Wright brothers first tested their gliders. So in that time frame, and say after World War I, test pilot flying became slightly more formal. Jimmy Doolittle was a test pilot at McCook Field. Jimmy Doolittle in 1929 flew the first totally instrumented flight, where he didn't see outside the cockpit from takeoff, flight, and landing. But that was one of Jimmy Doolittle's. By the way, Jimmy Doolittle, for aviation enthusiasts, was also the first pilot to fly on outside loop. He did that in 1927. So Jimmy Doolittle did a lot of things before April of 1942, when he led the Doolittle Raiders on that famous raid off the Carrier Hornet to Japan. But as I said, at McCook Field, you might be greeted on the ground by Orville Wright, because it was the home of the Wright brothers. Wright Field, that I actually flew out of a little bit in its later stages, was a very limited, small field. They developed Patterson Field, which was a couple of miles to the west, and Wright Field, as the sign says, the field was pretty small, so you guys use it all. Testing at Wright Field developed out of McCook Field when local entrepreneurs bought up a bunch of acres and donated it to the Air Force. There was no test pilot school in 1941. First formal test pilot school started in 44. And then test pilot school moved to Edwards Air Force Base up here in the high desert in 1951. I tested at Wright Field from about 1969 to 1975, so that time frame there was still flight testing going on at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Test pilots consider Al Boyd to be the father of flight testing. He started out at Wright Field, and he's the gentleman who flew every single airplane that existed and had, as it says, over 23,000 hours and over 700 kinds of airplanes. And he's the gentleman that moved flight testing from Wright Field to Edwards Air Force Base, primarily because of weather, air traffic congestion, needed more runway, and they needed something special that was available at Muroc Army Airfield. Muroc was started by a family by the name of Coram, who started a family homestead there in 1910, and they were serving the miners in the area, the borax, the 20 mule team borax people, and those kind of people, and they wanted to start a post office. But the U.S. government bureaucracy said, sorry, we already have a Coram post office somewhere in Arizona. So the Corams were very innovative. They just reversed their name and said, well, let's name it Muroc. So Muroc Post Office became Muroc Army Airfield. And again, it was, Hap Army used it as a bombing range in the 1930s. And then during World War II, it was the final training base for a lot of fighters and bombers. And that picture on the side, and I don't know how to run the slide, you can see the wooden propeller on the front end of the P-59, the first jet airplane that the Air Force had. That was to keep it away from the prying eyes, long before satellites. But if people took pictures from a long distance away with high-powered lens, they thought it was still a prop plane. Muroc was renamed Edwards Air Force Base after Captain Glenn Edwards, who was killed flying the YB-49 at Edwards. So they named it after Glenn. Chuck Yeager, I'll talk more about Chuck later. But Chuck, of course, I'll remember him as the first person to fly faster than the speed of sound, flying the X-1 in October 1947. Test pilot school started at Edwards in 1951. And it became more complicated. They started teaching the test pilots how to understand the equations that made an airplane fly. And so they, as I said, they went from silk scarves to slide rules. Test flying is pretty complex. You can read this, but all sorts of different kinds of techniques to figure out if an airplane was performing the way it was supposed to. One of the things, the T-33 behind you in the center is the main airplane that I flew, and it was used at the test pilot school in the 1960s to teach a pilot how to become a test pilot. Basically, 6 months of test pilot flying was flying that airplane very precisely. We used to stick a yaw string on the front of the airplane. We put grease pencil marks on the canopy, looking out the canopy, drawing a tree of grease pencil marks to fly a particularly precise trim shot, because our eyeball looking through those grease pencil marks on the horizon up at the high desert was more accurate than the instruments in the airplane, where you were trying to, an altitude indicator had delay, an airspeed indicator had delay. So that we did an awful lot of work of flying that particular airplane. One of the things that we did in that airplane that was kind of fun, I think I'll show it to you in a minute, but test pilot training was primarily spent most of the time in learning how to fly the airplane very precisely. So I said that about 70% of the training that I went through in the test pilot school for a year was learning how to fly handling qualities. And about 30% was on the other systems. The other systems that in the airplane had to work. The avionics, the radar, the weapon systems, the drop. Those are all systems. They don't have much to do with flying airplane, but they spent most of the time in the test pilot school teaching you how to fly it very precisely, so the engineer knew what exact spot you were at when you were testing for something, like how much stick force per G. You roll the airplane into a bank at Mach 1 and pulling about 5 Gs, but you had to hit a very, very precise altitude and airspeed so the engineers can analyze this data and develop things like the flight manual that became the tool that everybody flew by in flying the airplane operationally. To become a test pilot, when I went through the test pilot school, you had to have over 1,000 hours of flying time. In my case, it was all jet fighter time. You had to have an engineering degree, pass a test physical. I'll talk a little bit about the movie, The Right Stuff. If you remember that Right Stuff movie, when they showed the astronauts going through that weird flight physical at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, with tubes sticking out of every orifice in their body. We did go through those physicals. They put us in a centrifuge. I remember the centrifuge at Brooks. They put us in, try to see if you could still maintain some degree of flight control. And we called it the Order of the Elephant, because in the centrifuge spinning around, I was pulling 15 Gs. A heck of a lot more than we pulled in airplanes, then or now. I make the joke about being a little bit goofy, because there's a lot of fun stories about test pilots. And our test pilot professional organization is the Society of Experimental Test Pilots. The Society of Experimental Test Pilots has about 2,500 members, 30 different countries. I've been a member of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots for over half a century. I just got my 50-year patch. Of course, I only tested airplanes for a small number of years, but you stay in that organization for the rest of your life. At Edwards, the test pilot school was visited by, I want to back that up a second. The test pilot school was visited by the Palm Springs Air Museum last year. Myself, Fred Bell, and Greg Penny went to Edwards, and they started the Warbird Wednesday. So there's a whole series on Warbird Wednesdays, if you watch them, about what the test pilot school is today. Test pilot graduates, all sorts of famous names. There are now over 3,200 graduates. The first graduate of the test pilot school in 1944 was Richard Baum, famous World War II flying ace. He was test pilot graduate number 1. The guy in the lower right-hand corner, the little guy there is me. I was test pilot number 853, graduated from the school. These people that we show on here from the X-15, people like Pete Knight and Bob White. By the way, Bob White, today, April the 13th, is also the history of Bob White being the first U.S. Air Force pilot to fly the X-15. That was in 1960. Chuck Yeager, Fitz Fulton, Bob Cardenas. Some of you who've been around the museum a long time probably remember Bob. He used to come here to the museum. He passed away a couple of years ago. He's a very good friend of Frank Trulo's. But Bob was the gentleman who flew the B-29 that had the honor of towing Chuck Yeager airborne in the X-1 and launching it in October of 1947. Bob also later was an F-105 driver in Vietnam. But Bob Hoover, Tony LeVere, Bud Anderson, John Conrad, I can name them on and on. There's hundreds of them. Pete Knight, a good friend of mine, passed away a couple years ago, lived up at Palmdale. He was a state senator, state representative from Palmdale in his later life. But Pete still holds the speed record in the X-15 of Mach 6.9, I think it was, about 4,500 miles an hour. Neil Armstrong was a test pilot there. Harry Andonian, Guy Townsend, named him Buzzy Lynch, who lives here in Palm Desert, good friend of ours. Buzzy was the first pilot to fly the A-10. Buzzy graduated from the test pilot school about a year ahead of me. Guys who first flew the F-16, Bill Ostracher, Joe Bill Dryden, famous test pilot who lived in Palm Desert in his later years, Bob Gilliland. Bob Gilliland flew the F-104. He was also the first pilot to fly the SR-71, very famous Lockheed test pilot. Continue the names. The couple of guys that flew the F-5E for me, Joe Waters was killed during the test program. He was actually flying an F-4. But Paul Metz and John Taylor and Tony Zhang, there are hundreds and hundreds of these guys. And several hundred of those pilots and air crew members were killed in the history of flight testing. Commandants of the test pilot school, you might recognize Buzz Aldrin, of course, astronaut, was on the moon with Neil Armstrong. Chuck Yeager, I'll talk more about Chuck Yeager's time as a commandant of the test pilot school. A lot of people don't know this gentleman on the right. It's Jimmy Doolittle. Anybody remember Jimmy Doolittle? This is Jimmy Doolittle III. Jimmy Doolittle III was Jimmy Doolittle's grandson. He's been here at the museum a couple of times. He was a commandant of the test pilot. He used to work for me, actually, when I had my A-10 squadron. He later became commandant of the test pilot school, and now is very involved in the restoration of the Flight Test Center Museum at Edwards Air Force Base. It's going to be placed, is in the process of being placed outside the gate, so you don't have to have special clearances to get into the base. You'll be able to get in and see it. It's right near Century Circle, which is about halfway between Rosemont and Edwards Air Force Base. So that's going to be a great asset for us in the future too, when they get their whole museum moved outside the gate. No story about flight testing would be complete without telling a little bit about Pancho Barnes and the Happy Bottom Riding Club. Pancho Barnes was a very famous female aviator in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. She placed herself up at Edwards about the time that Muroc was becoming Edwards Air Force Base, and started a ranch and a bar. It was not a brothel. People could argue about that an awful lot. She swore to it. Bob Cardenas said, no, it was not a brothel. And the only thing Pancho says is that she didn't know what her girls did on their off time. But anyway, Pancho Barnes Happy Bottom Riding Club. Chuck Yeager is known as having said he spent more time at the Happy Bottom Riding Club than he did flying airplanes. But the Happy Bottom, another thing about Chuck Yeager and the Happy Bottom Riding Club. You remember the movie The Right Stuff, and I'll show you a little clip from it in a minute. But in that movie, Chuck Yeager is actually in the movie. He plays the bartender serving himself a drink. That was played by Sam Shepard, getting a drink at the Happy Bottom Riding Club. This is the whole reason that Edwards Air Force Base is where it's at. Rogers Dry Lake. 64 square mile lake. Look at the size of it compared to the whole Air Force Base complex. The main runway is probably 7.5 miles long. You can land 360 degrees. That dry lake, and it's dry most of the year. If it's wet, of course, it's shut down and not available, and that did limit some of the flight testing at times if the dry lake was wet, because you needed that. That's the place where the space shuttle first landed. It's the place that, well, let me show you this. It's the place that I landed. One time I was testing the A-7D Corsair II, and the engineers wanted to ice it up. So they iced it up a little bit with me flying it. It was behind a KC-135, like Gary Luder's flies, but this thing was not giving me fuel, it was giving me yellow water. It sprayed all over me, I looked like a popsicle. And the ice built up all over the speed brake, the intake, the canopy, and the radome out front. Unfortunately, the ice came off in one big clump down the intake, dinged the fan in front of the engine, didn't ding the compressor, but the turbofan, the fan blades in front were all twisted. It sounded like the engine was coming apart on me. So I made the wise decision to shut it down since I was over the lake bed, and that's my only dead stick landing. I was able to be a glider and landed that airplane on the lake bed. But it saved hundreds of millions of dollars of air vehicles because the lake bed was there. Great reason that Al Boyd put the Air Force test pilot business out to Edwards Air Force Base because of Rogers Dry Lake. There's another dry lake just just a little bit west called Roseman Dry Lake. It also has some runways marked on it, but the primary thing was Rogers. You could use it anytime you wanted. I landed this airplane, the F-104, on that lake bed as well, just in practice landings. It was just for drill, to learn how the hard surface worked. It was very, very hard surface, but the only time I dead sticked it was that particular flight in the A-7. Let's see. Oh yeah, this is worth watching. It's a little bit about the capabilities that exist at Edwards Air Force Base. When we did spins in the T-33 behind you, this facility called Sport would watch this. It's a long-range radar optical tracking system. Watch this little video for a few seconds.
Branch utilizes radar and optical tracking equipment to obtain precise trajectory data for the experiments and prototype aircraft. Through this master station and its 9 operating satellites, it is possible to fix the position of an aircraft in space with an accuracy of 10 feet. As the aircraft enters the tracking range for a spin test, ground stations begin
Malfunction.
Branch utilizes radar and optical tracking equipment to obtain precise for the experiments and prototype aircraft. Through this master station and its 9 operating satellites, it is possible to fix the position of an aircraft in space with an accuracy of 10 feet. As the aircraft enters the tracking range for a spin test, ground stations begin recording. This is the initial spin for the prototype of the F-100F two-place jet trainer. All Air Force aircraft must prove their recoverability from spins. In this case, as is often the practice during spin tests, wingtip deceleration rockets were installed. Their use was ineffective, and the anti-spin chute was deployed to no avail.
About 28 turns. Didn't always recover.
After approximately 28 rotations, the pilot safely ejected. Suitable spin recovery techniques and devices have since been developed.
I don't know who the pilot was flying at. I think it might have been Bob Hoover, but I'm not sure. But we used to sit in what was our ready room in the test pilot school and watch somebody else going up flying the T-33. We spun the T-33 up at Edwards as part of the test pilot school program. We had one airplane that had some weird center of gravity malpositioning in the airplane. It was kind of a warped airplane. So instead of spinning this airplane, as we're sitting down in the ready room, we watched a classmate of mine, by the name of Mike Lowe, tumble that airplane. So instead of spinning like this, he was going ass over tea kettle, going down for several groups, and we're down saying, okay, Mike, figure this one out. Anyway, he eventually did. He was able to get the stick pointed down, get a little bit more airspeed, get some reasonable angle of attack, and was able to fly out of it. But we'd sit watching with the Sport capability. Sport also tracked Chuck Yeager's accident that I'll talk a little bit more about in the NF-104. And there's some video out on YouTube that shows his malfunction mission where he actually had to eject. I'll talk about that in a second. Another type of flight testing, besides spin testing, civilian control, performance, all-weather, landing tests, all sorts of things, is a weird kind of testing called flutter. Flutter is extremely, extremely difficult to predict, and it's very hard to figure out what the limits you need to put on an airplane so you don't get into flutter. Flutter destroys things. Flutter is a combination of flexing and torsion at the same time. And technically, it's hard to describe, so I'm going to show you, rather than try to talk about all these accidents, I'm going to try to show you a little bit about what flutter is. You remember the Tacoma Narrows Bridge? Watch this.
The actual collapse of the world's third largest...
This is flutter. 35-mile-an-hour bridge.
Only a 35-mile-an-hour wind is blowing, but this apparently sets up a rhythmic swinging of the bridge, which increases with each swing.
This gentleman did it, but unfortunately his dog didn't. He was in the car.
Finally, the swinging road and the suspension cables give way and plunge into the water below. Fortunately, the only casualties were a car stalled on the bridge and a dog.
So, that's an explanation of what flutter is. This is a little bit of an explanation of what it looks like on airplanes. And it can destroy airplanes. This is the reason why you have, in simple terms, a V not to exceed, a velocity not to exceed an airplane. So you don't approach flutter. Flutter can be at a certain speed excited by some kind of an input, whether it be extreme turbulence or something else. But that's why the FAA has regulations that builds a buffer in the front end of an airplane's velocity limits to avoid this kind of business. Flutter is like your flag flying. It tears your flags apart. This is what it looks like on the tail of an airplane. A glider is a good example of the big bending moments that you have on these large wings. Can happen to all kinds of airplanes. I don't have a lot of experience in helicopters, but maybe we can talk about flutter in wings as well, with leading wing and trailing wing, those kind of things. Pretty good example of it here in a small glider. C-141. It's winging, and you can see the tail horizontal stabilizer. Even on a fighter, watch it do vertical stabilizers. Flutter is what you want to avoid. Flutter flight testing is a very difficult procedure, mostly for the engineers and also the pilots get into it. If you get close to it, man, you cut it off real quick and slow the airplane down below that V not to exceed. And as I think I said, the FAA's regulation on most airplanes is a 30% margin. Complicated world. Test pilot school, they tried to pump all this stuff in us. I had an engineering degree, but there were some guys with PhDs and masters that were going through the school with me, and they dragged me through things like nonlinear differential equations and other things that you had to learn to understand the basics of flight. Edwards' motto is toward the unknown, expect the unexpected. And they always told us when we were getting up there, remember, you volunteered to try to do this stuff. In 1967, after I came back from Vietnam and I spent a short tour at Luke as an instructor pilot in the F-104, I was selected to go to the Aerospace Research Pilot School. At the Aerospace Research Pilot School, I got to fly the NF-104. They built 3 special airplanes. Lockheed built them with a 6,000-pound thrust rocket in the tail. In 1960-something, Chuck Yeager was the commandant of the test pilot school before I got there and was trying to set the world altitude record in one. And he got into trouble at 100,000 feet and eventually had to jump out of it. There were 2 left, and I got to fly one of the other 2. This is a clip from the right stuff. This is kind of fun to watch, just a break. If you remember the right stuff. Hey guys, you get a plane over here with the What kind of plane is that? It's not an NF in the Hollywood movie. It was a regular 104. They didn't have any NF 104s at that time. They could fly. Sam Shepard flying Chuck Yeager. Climbed up to 35,000 feet, got out to Mach 2 plus. And climbed up at about a 60-degree climb angle. He was trying to set the world altitude record. He got the thing too vertical, and the reaction control jets couldn't bring the nose back down. So he got into a spin. He rode it down, he tried everything he could to get out of the spin. He stopped it once, got into spin the other direction, he deployed the drag chute, he did all sorts of things. And eventually, at about 8,000 feet, sea level, he ejected. The ejection seat hit the spacesuit, face mask, faceplate on, oxygen-rich environment, burned up his face pretty bad. He wound up surviving. Spent a couple of months in the hospital, but continued on with his Air Force career. Over there. So, Chuck jumped out of the airplane. A couple years later, after the Air Force investigated it, the accident, and found out that he was basically vertical, didn't have enough react. Up at that altitude, the ailerons, rudder, and elevator don't really work. So he's trying to use the reaction control jets, which were in the nose and in the tail for yaw, to try to get the airplane back down, to lower the angle to lower the angle of attack so he could start flying again. He wound up, the accident board basically said that he got into a spin because of a auto rotation of the engine as it was idling down at very slow airspeeds at high altitude. A lot of controversy about his accident, but basically he couldn't get the nose back down to get it flying again and had to jump out. So I went through the school a couple of years later, and this is my class that went through in 1967. And the test pilot school was renamed the Aerospace Research Pilot School, with basically 6 months of test flying and 6 months of astronaut prep school. Bunch of good guys in there. Some of them aren't still with us. One guy that's in there, Bruce Hines, was the first guy to fly the B-2. Mike Lowe, the guy that was tunneling the T-33 that we were laughing at from the ready room, later became the acting chief of staff of the Air Force, 4-star general. Ray Jones, the guy standing up on the far right, was paralyzed testing a BD-5, was becoming a BD-10 small jet at Edwards Air Force Base, and became a paraplegic and became a professor at the test pilot school for the rest of his life. A lot of fun guys in that class. We still have, we haven't had a reunion lately, have we? Yeah, Mike Clark. Mike Clark was a test pilot that worked with me on the F5E program. His wife was was a florist at the White House for about 20 years. Funny, fun story. Lots of fun people in the test pilot school. We had Navy guys, we had a couple of FAA guys, 2 people from Germany. A very interesting mix of people. At the school, I got to fly the NF-104. That's me in my spacesuit on the left, and my granddaughter, who was copying me on the right with her shop vac. She sent me that picture, say, "Grandpa, I can do it too." and there were about 26 of us in the class, and they picked a small number of 4 of us to fly the NF-104. They decided after Chuck Yeager's accident, they shut the program down. It was going to be a trainer for lots of things like Space Shuttle and X-20 and things like that, and they decided to let a few of us fly it, but it was several years later, and they wanted us to fly a restricted profile. They didn't want us going to 60 degrees, they wanted us to go about 40 degrees at climb. So it was kind of a restricted profile that we were flying. My Zoom mission was pretty simple. I missed the 40 degrees by 1 degree. I got to 101,830 feet. Short flight, good views, 36 minutes. I think I've got, yeah, this little clip, listen to this. This is Fred interviewing me up at Test Pilot School. We were up there last year. Fred Bell.
They built 3 of them, especially Lockheed Martin developed those and put the rocket in the tail. And it was to train pilots to go into possibly the X-20 dinosaur program or the manned orbiting laboratory or space shuttle. A lot of edge of space training. So unfortunately, Chuck Yeager, when he was coming out of this test pilot school, flew one of those airplanes and was in the process of trying to set the world altitude record when he got in trouble at 100,000 feet, got in the spin, jumped out, and that's the movie The Right Stuff.
So how about your experience?
Well, that's what I'm getting to right now, is they left 2 airplanes after Chuck jumped out of one, there were 2 left. I got to fly one of the other 2. I was in a class of 25 guys here, and they picked 4 of us to be the first students. We were the first student class to fly the NF-104, the rocket airplane. So I was one of those 4, and 3 other smart guys and me. I had more 104 time than the rest of them, so they asked me to go fly it. So I got a chance to fly it in June of 1968 to 101,830 feet.
What, did you fly it more than once?
I did. You flew two little checkout profiles in it just because the airplane was slightly different, so I did a couple of touch and go landings for a familiarization flight and that, and then a short flight, just lighting the rocket, short rocket light, and then actually did the zoom mission.
What goes through your mind? You were in a suit, weren't you?
Yeah, okay. Full blown space suit, my own little private air conditioner and that kind of stuff, walking out to the airplane.
So what goes through your mind before you light that candle?
Well, it was interesting. There's a whole bunch of interesting checks you go through to make sure it's all safe. But you want to make sure that the spacesuit's going to work if it's needed. And you also want to make sure all the systems are working, because the airplane, when you're going to fly it at very high altitude, the regular flight controls don't work. The elevator, the ailerons, make the airplane turn. The rudder to help you turn the airplane don't operate at that 100,000 feet. So we have a reaction control system. So you want to make sure that all that system are checked out and working. You check the nitrogen pressurization system so that you didn't have to fly with a blown up spacesuit while you're trying to fly this airplane over the top.
Right.
So, just going through the normal checks. Actually, it was a pretty short flight. It was only 35 minutes long. Take off, climb up, go fast, go Mach 2.25, and
To a good view.
when you get over the top, in the zoom, you're flying the airplane, so you're doing a lot of things to make sure you're flying the airplane at the proper angle of attack and inducing no yaw, no side, so you don't get into a spin like Chuck Yeager, unfortunately, got into and trying to set the altitude record. But yeah, when you're over the top, about 2 minutes of 0 G time pushing with the reaction control jets flying the airplane over, maintaining an angle of attack that was safe. But I can see all the way out, taking off east of here from Barstow, pointing towards Santa Barbara, doing a mission right up overhead this building in case the jet engine didn't restart. So I shut the jet engine down, burn the rocket out until the rocket burns out, then you're ballistic. You come back in and relight the jet and land. But over the top of my views, you asked that question, I could see down to Baja and up to Monterey Bay.
It was a fun flight, but it wasn't. Only did one zoom mission. About 30 of us got to fly that airplane, those 2 airplanes, after Chuck jumped out of the one, and the other one, the rocket motor blew up, so it was wiped out as well. So the only airplane that's left is mine. That's a picture of me when Fred and Greg and I were up there last year. 760 sits in front of the test pilot school, and it's a Kodak photo op right now. All the test pilot classes take their picture in front of it. When I got up there and told them, the commandant of the school said, "We got a guy that flew that airplane." They couldn't believe it, that there was still one around. Test pilots has changed. It's gone into all sorts of stuff. They're doing space testing. They're doing drones. They're doing missiles. They're doing collaborative aircraft. Drones like the Predator hanging up over the top of the T-33, a drone airplane. All sorts of testing going on at Edwards. One of the big things that's going on right now is software. they have a software simulation thing that simulates the F-35 environment. They test all the new software mods for that airplane. Digital twins, hypersonics, all sorts of buzzwords. The test pilot school now has the X-32, which is a variable stability, basically an F-16 derivative, in which they can program in any kind of an airplane design and go up and fly it before it actually has to be built into an airplane. Enormous capabilities. This is a little short, keep my timing, little PR about what Edwards does today, and then and now.
This is the edge of what we're capable of. Every milestone in aerospace history has seen the skies. This is where we stood on the shoulders of giants and saw the future.
The SR-71 that was flown by Bob Gilliland.
To fly faster, longer, and safer. To make our warriors stronger and our enemies tremble. Our mission is test. Our goal is to find the unknown. And we go further. We set the standard. We are innovators. We will not accept the status quo. The warfighter depends on us to be agile, responsive, and accurate. Our success is theirs. Before aircraft leave the ground, before weapons find their mark, there is test. A community of professionals chasing excellence in all we do. Every member of our team serves. Each play a part in accomplishing this test mission. We brought the F-35 to operational capability. We modernized the fleet to fly for years to come. We tested radar systems to precision. We made airdrops more efficient. Parachutes more dependable. Airmen safer. Test pilots are trained here.
Testing is, I don't know, it's a combination of lots of things, and I've tried to tell a little bit about it. The F-5E was an airplane that I tested from start to finish. Well, not quite finished because it's still going on. But I tested it in the early days of 1971. We flew prototypes. I first flew the F-5E in 1972. This airplane was not designed for the Air Force, but it was such a great airplane, not competitive with the F-15, F-16, and A-10, but such a great airplane that the Navy wanted. They screamed at me to try to get some for the Top Gun school, which we were able to get to them. I got Navy test pilot Muggsy McHugh with the first flight in 1973. I stayed with it until 1975, and this airplane, if you remember the movie, the first Top Gun movie, it was the MiG-28, the one that Iceman and Maverick went to try to shoot down off the carrier at the end of the movie. The MiG-28, that black airplane, was the F-5E. That airplane is still flying today. It's flying at Yuma for the Marine test pilot or weapons school business, weapons tactics instructor course. It's flying at Navy Fallon and Top Gun. It's flying for the Air Force in the aggressor business. Still flying in quite a few countries around the world. And it was a super airplane. It evolved into the F-20, which is probably the best fighter that was never built into production. Great airplane. I'm going to cut it off because I want to talk about the end of it all it's going today. Please watch the Warbird Wednesday programs that the museum has about the Test Pilot School. And it's 5.5 minutes to 2. Thank you all very much.